This is Free to Exchange, the show where free markets and free-thinking scholars meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Today we're going to explore some of the unintended consequences of government regulation. First, we'll explore how government regulation intended to promote safety and well-being of people can impact poorer Americans. Then, on the second half of the show, we'll discuss how government regulation and corruption interact, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worst. My first guest is Dr. Deanna Thomas. Dr. Thomas is an associate professor of economics at the Heider College of Business at Creighton University. She's also director of Creighton's Institute for Economic Inquiry. Deanna, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ben.
So before we get into regulation of risk and actions taken to promote safety by the government, let's just start with how the economic approach to thinking about this. How do people mitigate risk in their private lives?
Yeah, so we are exposed to all kinds of risks in our daily lives, right? The biggest cause of mortality in this country is heart disease, followed by cancer and then accidents. And we do all kinds of things in our day-to-day lives to kind of mitigate those risks, right? So we change our diet, we change our exercise routine, we use different modes of transportation to get to where we want to go in order to account for different risk profiles of those activities. And that's what we do privately in order to lower the risks that we experience in our lives.
And I bet it's not an accident, the things that you were listing, the things that people modify their behavior most about probably carry greater risk.
Right, yeah, so people are really sensitive to the risks that affect them the most, and they're less sensitive to risks that don't affect them very much, right? So if you could just think about, for example, you live in a really busy neighborhood and you have little kids, you put a fence around your house in order to prevent them from running on the street. But if you live in a quiet neighborhood with like a cul-de-sac or something, then you don't do that necessarily, right? So we're very aware of the things that are major sources of risk in our lives, and we usually are pretty good at preventing those sorts of things.
Okay, and from thinking about different people then, not just cul-de-sacs versus busy streets, other than people's own personal risk kind of aversion or loving, what are things that make some people more willing to take on greater risk than other people?
Right, everybody is different in terms of their willingness to experience risk, and obviously how much you benefit from something will also change the way you experience the risk or the way you prevent from experiencing certain risks, right? So, lots of people drive motorcycles, right, or ride motorcycles. I don't do that, but they have a strong preference for doing something like this because they get more joy out of doing it, right? So different people do different things and kind of mitigate risks in different ways.
And this can relate to income too, both on the earning side and your willingness to pay. So things
Right.
like working in commercial fishing or forestry
Right.
are dangerous jobs.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so depending on the kind of job you have, you will experience different risks, right? So if you work in a mine, that's obviously more risky than being like a university professor, which is what I do, right? So depending on what kind of job you have, you'll experience different risks, and you'll be more aware of some risks than others.
I don't know, Janet, you should see some of the hate mail that I get.
Right, you always have to worry about that, and then students, right? But
in general, the people who work in these professions that are risky get paid more relative to what they'd expect somewhere else.
Yeah, definitely. So one way that we compensate for those sorts of risks that we experience professionally is that you just get paid more if you experience higher risks. That's right. Right.
And then on the flip side, what's the difference of people mitigating risk in their private lives, not their work lives necessarily, and how that relates to earnings or incomes?
Yeah, so I think generally people are pretty much the same no matter what their income is in terms of how they go about mitigating risks. And all we really
Meaning
want
that they
is
try to mitigate the worst risks
That's
first and
exactly
most
right.
cost efficiently.
That's right. Yeah,
Okay.
Everybody wants to do it in the most cost efficient way, and everybody is going to address the risks that affect them most first, right? So you're most aware of the things that are the biggest risks to your life and health, and so you take care of those first. And then as you get more income, you start addressing lower probability risks that also might affect you, right? So I live in Omaha. Omaha is a Superfund site. I happen to live in the Superfund site. And there is there's some lead in the ground, and that's a danger for my kids. And so some people remove the topsoil in their yards in order to make sure that their kids don't get any lead exposure from, digging in the grass or whatever. But other people don't do that, right? So in poorer neighborhoods, people won't have taken care of those sorts of risks. But in richer neighborhoods, they will. Because the probability of getting lead exposure from that is relatively small. Only people with a lot of money tend to take care of those sorts of risks.
Right, and we see this in cars that people purchase and stuff. It used to be the person who bought the Volvo or something wanted extra safety.
Right.
could afford to and paid more for that.
Right, that's right. Or people, nowadays people have rear view cameras that prevent back over accidents, and some people will pay extra to get those sorts of features in their car, and some people won't.
All right, so now that we've covered how people generally go about thinking about, how does government regulation come in?
Yeah, so government regulates risks also. So it's not only that we do it privately, but government also takes care of certain risks. And everybody knows about the primary risks that government tries to address, right? So traffic rules are a way that government addresses risks, potential risks from driving. There are risks related to occupational hazards that are regulated by OSHA. There are environmental risks that the EPA regulates. And then there are health and safety risks. Some of them are regulated by the FDA and different organizations like that, different bureaucratic agencies like that.
And does the government regulation of these risks correspond to the same type of calculus that individuals do in terms of the most regulations address the most dangerous risks and do so most cost effectively?
I don't think so, and here's why. I think that government regulation at the end of the day kind of responds to just general public perceptions of what risks are, and sometimes those can be skewed, either because there's just bad information out there or because a particular group is interested in pushing for a particular regulation that benefits them, and then we get bad information about the actual pervasiveness of those risks. And then government tends to regulate things that are not necessarily in the public interest to be regulated, but are the interest of a particular group.
So rather than the experts objectively weighing costs and benefits, it's driven by politics?
Yeah, definitely. It's driven by politics, yeah. So government regulates occupational health and safety, but a lot of the time the risks that they address are extremely expensive to mitigate, but really, really small ex-ante probability risks. So, for example, with OSHA, occupational hazards are only about 0.36 out of 10,000 people are ever affected by an occupational risk in a given year. So out of 10,000 people, only 0.36, not even a whole person, right, will experience an occupational accident in a given year. But there are tons of OSHA rules that are supposed to regulate occupational risks.
So how does this then translate? So people understand, if I say that the tax code is progressive, they understand that means as you earn more, you're going to pay more in taxes.
Right.
How does regulation impact high income versus low income people then?
Yeah, so just like with almost anything else government does, maybe except taxes, right? The cost of regulation is borne by everybody, right? So if you buy a product that's regulated in some way, which everything that we consume and do in our lives is regulated in some way, then the price of that thing will be higher, right? Just because it's more expensive to produce, if you, as a producer, you have to comply with federal regulation for health and safety and occupational hazards and stuff like that. So everything we buy is more expensive as a result of the fact that it's regulated. Now, everybody has to pay for that increase in the price, but lower income people will, on average, be affected more dramatically by those higher prices. And that makes sense if you just think about how much money as a percentage of their budget they spend on consumption and housing and all those sorts of things. So take, for example, childcare regulation. Okay, so childcare is heavily regulated because people are really concerned about the safety of children, and that's a really popular issue. If ever anything happens in a child care center, there are alarm bells, right, go off, and everybody knows about it, and it's on the news and everything.
Come on, Deanna, save the children.
That's right, save the children. That's why it's extremely heavily regulated, right? Now, the way that child care is regulated might affect child safety in some way, and it definitely could potentially benefit child safety and the quality of care. But another thing it does is it has an extreme effect on the price of child care. So child care is extremely expensive in this country because it's extremely heavily regulated. Now, higher income people will be able to compensate or just eat up the cost of that regulation, right? So if I pay a little bit more for child care, that's okay. But lower income people can't pay for the more expensive childcare, and so they're basically regulated out of the market. Or if they do have to pay for it, then it becomes a significant portion of their budget. So we know that on average, lower income families pay about 30% of their income For childcare services, where higher income people, it's only about 7% of their income. And so this is where you get the regressive effect, right? If I have to pay 20% more for childcare, but it's 30% of my budget, then that's a significant impact on my income. Where a higher income family that only pays 7% of their income on childcare, and they have to pay 20% more, for them it doesn't really matter all that much.
Right, so disproportionately it's the poor that bear the cost of this regulation.
Yeah.
And also then, because you mentioned that some of them just can't afford to buy it then. The question is, on net, does this make children safer if instead of sending them to an official child care facility, they just let the older kid watch them at home or something like that?
Yeah, so that's what ends up happening is that you get a division, right? So basically people are just precluded from participating in the official economy, and they're in the black market for childcare, which means there are unregulated childcare providers that don't have to comply with the laws because they're not, they're not being inspected by anybody, and so that can potentially lead to the children being in even worse situations than what you initially had.
Sure. Now, another one that I know you've done a little bit of work on is like inhalers, something that many people have from asthma.
Right.
What's the regulation with that, and how, does that exhibit this type of regressive effect too?
Yeah. So. Asthma inhalers used to have CFC as a propellant in them. CFC is the chlorofluorocarbon that is basically just the propellant that gets the medicine out of the inhaler, right? So they used to be propelled with CFC, but in 2014 the FDA basically outlawed CFC as a propellant in asthma inhalers. This was a law that followed up on a lot of other laws that had regulated the use of CFCs and other industrial uses in the 80s and 90s. And at the time, people were really concerned about the ozone layer. So ever since the 80s and 90s, when this industrial regulation came in, the ozone layer has been recuperating, and it's on track to being back to pre-1980 levels by 2020. But this new law that basically made it impossible for pharmaceutical companies to use CFC in medical inhalers just was passed in 2014, so it's relatively new. Now, as a result of this law, asthma inhalers have tripled in price. They used to be about $20, now they're $60. And so that means, again, just like with the example of childcare, right? If something like this triples in price, not a big deal for a relatively wealthy person, but a low-income person that already is, trying to gather their money just in order to get this asthma inhaler, paying 3 times the price that they used to makes a huge difference. So yeah, I think regressive effects there too.
So just in the last few seconds then, if someone were usually defending regulation in this way, they might say that a lot of the poorer people don't know what's best for them. These experts are who knows best.
Right.
What do you say to them in the last few seconds?
I think experts know a lot about expert knowledge, but I think they don't know what the specific person in every situation experiences and what the actual sources of risk are for individuals in their lives. So they don't know what good childcare is for a low-income person because they can't compare their opportunity cost, right? They don't know what the alternatives are for that person. And so at the end of the day, really the person on the ground has more information that's more relevant for making decisions about how they mitigate risks in their lives than the government expert might have.
Well, thank you for joining us today. Up next, corruption's bad, right? But can it ever be good? Stick around to find out what my next guest thinks.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Jamie Pavlik. Dr. Pavlik is an assistant professor of economics in the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics here at Texas Tech University, where she's also a research fellow with our very own Free Market Institute. Jamie, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ben.
So, when I hear commentary about people talking about corruption, which is our topic here today, sometimes they'll refer to countries as, oh, that's a very corrupt country, or even worse, that culture's corrupt. That doesn't strike me as the economic way of approaching this. What would you say are the factors that go into making some place more or less corrupt?
Right, so that is a very common argument that you'll see countries have a lot of corruption because they are just different. They have a culture of corruption. They tend to be more immoral. That's not true. You'll see citizens from other countries traveling, and you'll see they tend to adjust their behavior to whatever the environment is in a different country. So if you see people coming to the United States, they're probably not going to try to bribe a cop, even if they would in their own country. So the culture of corruption comes from something else. It's not just an inherent characteristic of people. And what usually it comes from is some type of institutional factor or policies, or more importantly, regulation. A lot of corruption can happen because some individuals have a really hard time opening a business in a country. So Brazil is a country I tend to study a lot. A recent survey that looked at the ease of doing business in Brazil found that it took 80 days to open a small company. And those 80 days include things like you have to get certain documents. Sometimes you don't even know what documents you need, and you don't know what bureaus you have to kind of satisfy and what politicians to talk to. And when that happens, you'll see entrepreneurs find sometimes it can be easier to actually bribe a politician just to open a business. They're not trying to do anything else other than start their business as they would easily or relatively easy in a country like the United States, for example.
Right, so when artificial cost or regulatory costs have been added, bribery or corruption might be a cheaper way around.
Right.
And I guess more generally thinking about it, and thinking within our own country too, of where we witness corruption here, what about just in cases where if you and I would be better off trading, if there's some regulation that prevents us from trading?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility that you could have mutually beneficial exchanges, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but you can have beneficial exchanges that actually enable you to start a business quicker, and what that can do for the entire economy is you tend to be better off as an economy if you have more entrepreneurs. If you have corruption that enables entrepreneurs to start a business and produce goods that people value, then that could be a good thing.
Yeah, you know, in this context, I wasn't even thinking that deeply about it, just like in the United States in the drug trade.
Yeah.
If you and I think we each benefit, we're here at the story of the corrupt cop isn't the guy who gets paid off to ignore a murder. It's when people would engage in exchange and he has to look the other way.
Yeah, I mean, so you definitely have that here as well, and you get kind of this interaction then between corruption and what, if you're talking about the legal market or the drug market, that's sometimes called the shadow economy or the black market. So sometimes we have black markets because we have to get around regulations, and sometimes that's good if the official looks the other way in certain cases.
All right, so let's work our way through a couple of these issues that were in there. One of these is kind of the feedback loop.
Right.
Of once you have corruption, what does this put you on a spiral in the wrong direction, kind of?
Definitely. And so this is one factor that has been brought up since corruption's been studied in economics. So Andre Schleifer is probably one of the biggest corruption economists. His famous paper just called Corruption. He talks about how, you know, politicians are self-interested individuals. So even though in the short run, if you can make that mutually beneficial transaction where that allows entrepreneurs or the shadow economy to operate, so you can get around regulations, they also know that they can extract money because there are those regulations. So you might end up seeing politicians start enacting more regulations just to extract more money. The classic example of this is comparing the number of tolls on rivers in 1500.
Okay.
This is actually like the
I
classic
didn't know this.
example.
Tell me.
Yes. So what Schleifer actually does is he looks at the number of tolls in England versus the number of tolls in classically corrupt countries. And what you'll find is tolls start popping up everywhere in the corrupt countries because that's a way for politicians to extract money from individuals that are just trying to use rivers to transport goods. So what you would see then is entrepreneurs kind of make what would seem as more costly routes. So they go around the corrupt rivers because they get to experience less regulation and less corruption. So basically, if an official realizes he can extract money, he's going to do as many things as possible to extract more. Including
then creating regulations.
Yes.
Not so much for society's benefits, but creating regulations specifically because he can then be corrupted.
Right.
And
yes, exactly. So you just kind of get into this vicious cycle if you start relying on corruption to get around regulation.
So in terms of other unintended kind of side effects of it, then you also see, and you'd started to make this distinction, the formal and the informal sector.
Yeah, so that's a complex relationship, and what you often find is it depends on the country that you're in. And this also relates to inequality, which I'll get to in a second. So if you're in a country like the United States, we tend to have relatively better court systems in the sense that they're a little bit less biased and a little bit more accessible to all incomes than other countries, for example. Like I study Brazil again. So if you have a court system where you can reliably take a politician, for example, if they're trying to extort a bribe, you can take them to court, that means you're not going to have to pay that bribe. But there's other countries where you're forced into it, it's more extortion. So in Brazil, for example, what you see entrepreneurs doing is instead of dealing with the regulations and the corruption in the formal sector, they just go underground, and then you get this relatively large informal presence. In fact, in Brazil, which is on the news all the time recently, in the past couple of years anyway, about their corrupt levels in their federal government, you see sometimes in their municipalities that over 60% of their economy is informal.
And so by informal, we don't necessarily mean like illicit in the drugs, it just means not formally on the books because they're not going to abide by the regulations, but they're not going to pay the corruption either.
Right, yeah. So they're producing everyday normal legal goods that we would call any type of good you can think of. You can think of just construction or different services that you would get in a normal market. They're just not registered is usually how it goes in Brazil specifically.
So a lot of people, and I mean, I've seen various campaigns by the World Bank that just say, we must stamp out corruption.
Right.
In a situation like what you were just describing, would that be beneficial or not?
Blanket decreasing corruption is never a good idea. So you can't just go into a country and say we need to get rid of all of corruption, just like you can't go into a country and say we need to get rid of this informal sector entirely. There are poor people that depend on both of those things to actually function, right?
You mean both? They depend on corruption and informality?
And informality, yes. They can depend on informality if corruption's not beneficial for them, or they can benefit from corruption if it is beneficial for them. So you have to think of them as signals, essentially. If you see a country with a lot of corruption and a large informal sector, to me that's saying something else is going on that's causing those two factors that we need to focus on more as economists and policymakers.
Yeah, so it always strikes me when someone just says, absolutely, corruption must always be bad. I'm like, have you ever watched the movie like Schindler's List?
Right.
Like, that's clearly corruption, but it was saving lives.
Right.
In that case, it's not first best, it's second best good. First best would be you don't have
whatever policies driving corrupt acts or whatever regulation is driving corrupt acts, yes.
Yeah, so actually I think this is an important point maybe that you could elaborate just a little bit on then. When we see corruption, instead of having a blanket campaign that says we must end it, what would be the correct policy stance of how to address it?
Figure out where it's coming from. You can look at different things like the regulation. So
give me a concrete example like this of where it's coming from and how to get rid of it.
If it takes more than 30 days to open a business, that's probably where corruption's coming from. For example, you could just look at the number of different just steps you have to take if you have to go through a number of different bureaus. That just opens up the opportunity for corruption. You could look at things like if it is a democracy, we tend to see less corruption because voters can be knowledgeable about it. So if you see a lot of corruption, look elsewhere. Look at the whole institutional environment. Look at how the government's set up. Look at how politicians are elected. Look at how things, even in the United States, there's some problems with lobbying that it's kind of a fine line with, which in the previous episode, Deanna was talking about how some regulations aren't created to actually benefit people. They are created for other reasons. And my new research is going to explore how transparency helps with that, but you have to look elsewhere or look at where that corruption is coming from.
Much like a medical doctor sees someone with a fever, he doesn't say we must cure the fever, it's what's causing the fever, is analogous with corruption.
Right.
And, one big part of that answer is excessive regulation that prevents people from engaging in normal trade.
Yes. Yes.
All right, well thank you for joining us today, Jamie.
Thank you.
Public policy generally, and regulation in particular, is often evaluated both by bureaucrats and the public on its intended effects. But economics is about not just the intended effects, but also tracing out those unintended consequences of regulations and other policies that often go unseen by people. In my first guest, they talked about how well-meaning safety regulations have an unintended effect of raising costs of these services that are disproportionately borne by poorer people who might not share the same preferences for safety as richer people who might advocate for these policies, even though some people think it's in the name of poorer people that these policies should be advocated for. My second guest talked about how corruption is a symptom of something else gone wrong rather than the wrong itself. And that often that wrong is regulation that's preventing businesses from forming or people from engaging from trades that would make themselves better off. And as a result, they turn to corruption to get around those regulations. I suspect, based off the commentary of both of my guests and a host of other things, that we live in a world with far too much regulation and that would be much wealthier if we could cut significantly back on it. We'll see you next time.